If you have a mobile phone, if you'd like to put it on silent, please. Thank you. Right, huge welcome for the first time to Michael Goulding with Who Was Moses, What Was the Ark of the Covenant, and Are biblical accounts of the Exodus credible? Michael is a published author of several books and has the following websites: all the W's, michaelgoulding.co.uk, and all the W's, Legacy Of The Sphinx.com. During his research, prior to writing Legacy Of The Sphinx, he discovered many strange facts pertaining to the true science and their suppression from humanity. Michael's focus on these prominent stories attempts to expand on the biblical accounts of these events with links to modern day physics, hitherto undiscovered, or were they? Please welcome Michael Goulding.
First of all, can I say I'm really pleased to see you in the audience, and thank you for coming tonight. I am, as Rob says, a published writer and an author. I've published a number of books over the last 10 years, the first of which was Legacy of the Sphinx. Legacy of the Sphinx was a real bomber for me because I'd originally chosen the subject because it was one that I was particularly interested in, which was ancient mysteries. And when I first began to look at the possibility of it as a theme for the book, I realised that it required an awful lot of research. Because I'm one of those people who, if I'm going to have a theme to a book, I have to have the tip of the iceberg written about on the page and the whole of the iceberg underneath, and be very familiar with it and know it backwards and forwards. So I had to do the research, and I didn't know at that time that it was going to take me 5 years. But it took 5 years, and I think you'll understand as I go further into why the difficulty, and some of the difficulties that I have, which I will talk about. But at the time I was beginning to sort of research it, another author published his book on ancient mysteries, and he called his the Da Vinci Code. And so whilst he didn't steal my thunder exactly, his came out, he became a multimillionaire, and I stand before you tonight as a relatively unknown author and a very poor one. So congratulations to Mr. Brown, and let's hope I can go a bit further with this as I go on with my writing career. I started quite late, as you can probably see, but I write every day, all day. I'm a professional writer now. I gave up my job to do it, and I enjoy every minute of it. So that's me. I'm going to talk tonight, as you know, about Moses, and some of the difficulties of researching events that took place hundreds, if not thousands of years ago, are particularly time-consuming and problematical. At the beginning of the talk, I will tell you a little bit about some of those problems, which I'm sure some of them you will appreciate anyway, but some of them you may not. And I'm then going to go on to talk about Moses, who he actually was, his origins in actual fact, and then his exile, because he was exiled, as you know, and then I will go on to talk about his journey, that unbelievable journey that he undertook, and why he undertook it. And then I'll tell you about the ark that he built to take with him on his way, why he built it, and I'll tell you more about what it actually contained and what it actually did. And I think some of it will surprise you. Not all of it is in the Bible, and as you will be aware, not all of the Bible is anything that you think it is. It is in fact hand-picked, cherry-picked pieces of ancient manuscript which were highly selective, originally by Roman Catholic Church, but also by other bodies, and they were put together in a selective manner to achieve certain objectives, not one of which was to provide you with the facts. Some of them were historical, of course. Exodus in particular is a book of near facts, but others, such as the book of Numbers and Deuteronomy, were books of the Bible that were purely public relations material. They were there to try to establish the law as the writers originally wanted people to believe it. I feel that the Bible is, in many ways, poorly written because it was so selective. But the number one problem with it is that the people who wrote it because they wished to, representing the elite perhaps, or even just themselves, because they wished to convince other people of the truth as they saw it, not necessarily the whole truth, and not even sometimes any of the truth. So the first problem that one has in beginning one's research is that these people told lies. They told a lot of lies, and they told lies wholesale. And you need to be able to pick through what they have to say in the various books to understand the origin of those books, and then select your material very carefully, and then analyse it very carefully. The biggest problem is that all of these records, these ancient records, had to be translated. And as you will perhaps appreciate, in the translation, some got lost, some got misinterpreted, and some facts, a lot of facts in fact, were facts as they saw them at the time. And if I explain to you that Hebrew manuscripts make no difference between what just happened yesterday, what happened in the distant past, and what happened thousands of years ago. So linguistically, they didn't distinguish between one tense or another. And so therefore, you have to pick your way through their translations to determine when they're actually talking about, in terms of year or date. But the real biggie is another one. First of all, can I ask, does anyone listening to me tonight believe in God? Because my guess would be that some of you do, and some of you don't.
I believe in God.
I would also ask, do you believe in miracles? That is to say, unbelievable events that take place or have taken place, which are totally inexplicable in the light of our present knowledge.
Yeah, Dunkirk 6-day death card. That's one.
And I would guess that if we would all agree, if we wanted to call those the paranormal, that there are inexplicable events that do take place, and these are paranormal, if not miracles. So it's very important to you for me to tell you my position before I start talking about the Bible and extracts from it and my interpretation of it. And I'll tell you that now. I do believe that there is a supreme being that guides everything.
Well done.
It may well be that it's the universe itself. Interpret it how you like, believe in what you like, but I do believe. But I am not a churchgoer. And I am not religious at all. And I don't belong to any faith, or I don't subscribe to any particular philosophy. So I am, if you like, as far as possible, quite neutral. But by the time I got into this research, I was beginning to think, what is going on here? Because it was pretty obvious right from the start that something was going on in Egypt at the time, which was totally inexplicable and couldn't be explained by reading the extracts that are found in Exodus or any of the other books. Before I begin to cast serious doubts about what we all see and hear and feel around us, about the true nature of reality, and to cast doubts on so much of what you may have been taught about ancient history, let me say that one of the most remarkable events ever written about, the Exodus, is one of the best recorded events historically compared to most of the ancient history you will ever read about. If only some of it is partly true. In other words, if the vast majority of it is legend and you pick out those salient facts which you believe are important, if that is the case, then this Ark of the Testament has to have been one of the most unbelievably unusual and virtually unique artifacts in the whole of human history. Because what it is attributed of having done is defies logic, defies in fact the imagination. But tonight I'm going to hopefully shed some light on that. Let's talk about, just continuing with the business of the difficulties in undertaking any research of this sort, the different ancient manuscripts and the wording in some of them that has been interpreted and mistranslated over the years. I'll give you some particular examples. The word avod in ancient Hebrew meant quite simply work. Avod was work. Unfortunately, somewhere along the line, somebody mistranslated it as meaning worship. And therefore, people didn't go to work, they went to worship. And the places of working, the workshops, became temples. And so we have a misunderstanding right from the very beginning over this translation of the word avod, because it didn't mean worship at all, it meant work. And the people who supervised that work were known as craftsmen. And their skills were partly esoteric, mainly metallurgical. And the job was handed down from father to son through the generations. And my case rests, therefore, with the case of Joseph, who was not a carpenter at all, as he became known as. He was, in fact, a craftsman. He was a member of a particular sect called the Essenes, which more later, and he was no carpenter. He was a craftsman, and he was a very skilled craftsman, and he was revered for it and looked upon very highly for it. There are other examples of the same effects of mistranslation. But for now, let's just say that one of the other things that is never made clear in the Bible is that the place where Jesus lived, to take an example, was a seething cauldron of resentment, rebellion, politics, and fight against the Romans. It was a totally alien culture. The language that Jesus spoke was Aramaic, and there are no vowels in Aramaic. So I would like you to think of any familiar object that you see around you, such as the desk, the chair, me, the walls, the curtains, and try to think of a word for them without using vowels. It's not easy, if not impossible. And Jesus spoke Aramaic. So if you or I were transported into Judea at the time of Jesus, not only would we not understand a word of what anybody was saying, but we would be lucky to get away without being stoned or hailed as the Messiah. And many of them were. We will at least last perhaps a week or two speaking as we speak, not understanding anything. And probably our best bet would be to make ourselves into a leper, which again many of them did. I think, therefore, that what became apparent to me fairly early on was that we don't know what Jesus' psyche was. We don't know what he actually said. We can't speak the language unless we have a professorship in Aramaic, and even then it is extremely difficult. If I gave you the word for God in Aramaic, they breathe it, and it's practically unpronounceable, and it's something that even I can't do, but I'll have a try. The word for God was and that's how he breathed it. And it became known as Yahweh in the printed page, and that became Jehovah. And as we know, that is, to all intents and purposes, for many religions, God. So we have our problems, and I'll mention one more, which is important to mention because I talk about them throughout the lecture, and that is the difference between the Israelites and the Hebrews. The Israelites were the descendants of Abraham's son, David, who moved into Egypt and settled there centuries before Moses was even born. They were already there in Egypt, an indigenous part of Egypt, along with, of course, the Egyptians and the Hebrews who had been captured and were used as slaves. Many of them lowly slaves, some of them, very few, upper class slaves or upmarket slaves, as we would say. But they were slaves, and that is a difference. The Hebrews themselves, as a race, were the descendants of Abraham, who lived in what we would now call Palestine, Syria, the Lebanon, and Israel. So I'll make that difference, and I'd like you to bear that in mind, because I talk about Israelites and I talk about Hebrews all the way through. What of Moses? Well, the Old Testament makes it absolutely clear, and there is no argument or controversy over this point. He was an Egyptian. He was, in fact, we now know, it is now accepted by most historians, but not all, that he was the son of the 18th dynasty pharaoh Amenhotep III. He was the illegitimate son, unfortunately for Moses. And I say unfortunately because it meant that being illegitimate, he could never succeed his father. But there was another problem for Moses, and that is that the Egyptian royal families were integrated by the means of incest. Incest was practiced throughout those families, generation to generation. But the succession was through the matriarchal line. So therefore, when a person became the new pharaoh, it was when the old pharaoh died, and he had to be married to the pharaoh's daughter. And the pharaoh conjoined with his own sisters, and the new man would then conjoin with the pharaoh's daughter. i.e. the matriarchal line. They did this because, as we now know, this taints the blood. The generation after generation, succeeding ones are weaker, more infirm, and less capable of ruling. But they didn't know that. They thought the opposite. They thought that it purified the blood. But Tutankhamun, who I will mention later perhaps, who was in fact the son of Nefertiti and Moses, was weak, infirm, and didn't live beyond the age of 8 to 10 years. Probably because of that fact. If a new guy came in and married the Pharaoh's daughter, then the dynasty changed. But if the guy that married her was the Pharaoh's son, the dynasty continued. And Moses wasn't just a chancer, he was a clever guy. Because what did he do? He was educated because he was the son of a pharaoh from being a youth by the high priests of the god Ra and by others. But because he was educated as a pharaoh would have been, he was privy to the most arcane and esoteric knowledge available at that time, which we would call perhaps magic, but they would call metallurgy and science in their own words. And he, therefore, was a very highly educated guy who then was frustrated from ever becoming pharaoh because he was illegitimate. So what did he do? He promptly ran off and he married Nefertiti, who was the pharaoh's daughter. Nefertiti was the daughter of Amenhotep III, and therefore by marrying her, he could then, when the pharaoh died, succeed him as pharaoh. And duly, promptly, and when the pharaoh died, Moses, who was already acting as regent, became Amenhotep IV of the 18th dynasty. He was a pharaoh. But, as we know, because he was the son of Amenhotep and the daughter of one of his high-ranking officials, a Hebrew actually, Moses was actually half Egyptian and half Hebrew. So he was no respecter of Egyptian traditions at all. And what did he do? He probably changed his name to Akhenaten and instituted the worship of one god, Aten. He closed all the temples. He made everybody worship the new god Aten. He got rid of Isis and Osiris and all the others. And he caused mayhem. And in the process, he made a lot of enemies. So he was trouble for the ruling elite of Egypt at the time, and unsurprisingly, I guess, they deposed him and exiled him. They couldn't kill him or do anything bad to him because he was a pharaoh, a legitimate pharaoh, and he was therefore a god. And he was believed to have communed with the gods, and he was believed to be one of the gods. And if they touched a hair on his head, they would answer to the gods. That's what they believed, so they got rid of him instead. It's very interesting what happens now, because you would ask yourself, perhaps, where did he go? Well, as I've already said, Moses wasn't daft. Moses headed straight for the place where the Egyptians had excavated and mined for gold for centuries, for millennia. And it will become clear why they did that in a few minutes. But that's where he headed. And that was, if you look at the Red Sea, the two fingers that go up towards the Med, on the other side of the Med is a range of mountains. And in the middle of those mountains, the highest peak, in fact, was Mount Horeb, better known to you and I as Mount Sinai. And there, in the halls and chambers of a huge complex, a deep complex of underground workings, Moses spent the next generation. Now, in the words of the Hebrew language, that meant 25 years roughly. It meant a generation between father and son, 25 years. Estimates vary, different books estimate different periods, but it was anything between 20 and 30 years. That's a generation, and Moses was recorded as having spent a generation in this, we call it the temple. Because I'll tell you later what it contained and why he went there. But he did, because he knew of it, and this was where Moses would sit. And I'd like you to imagine this guy. He's an ex-pharaoh. He's used to the trappings of wealth and power like you and I have never believed, would never seen, would never believe. He was worshipped everywhere he went. And suddenly, he was on his own, in the desert. He must have raged, he must have despaired, he must have been at his wit's end. But one thing, it occurred to me as I'm reading all this, that he must have been thirsting for revenge. Anybody who was human would be thirsting for revenge. He wanted payback, and he was going to get it. But he had a problem. He had several problems, which we'll look at in a second. And the main problem was, if he was to go back there, which he effectively couldn't, he would be immediately frog marched out again. So that was pointless. He could never rule Egypt again, in fact. He knew that. He should have known that, and I'm sure he did. So what I thought would he do? He would plot his revenge, and he would plot it very carefully, and he would prepare for it, because he would go back, and he would give them payback, and he would do for them, and he would actually get his revenge, if at all possible. This guy spent 25 years doing something. I said to myself, what on earth was it he could have been doing for 25 years? He took several of his relatives with him. He would have had hangers on, of course. He would have had people there that he got to know. He was revered still. He was still, in their eyes, a pharaoh. So he wasn't on his total jackpot, but he didn't really have the company of his superiors, and he didn't really have the company of the high priests, who were, in fact, the most powerful people in Egypt. But what would you do? I think we know what he did, and I'm coming to that, and you won't be surprised at what he did, because he made all the preparations that he possibly could in order to go back and create his own dynasty. He couldn't create it in Egypt. Of course he couldn't. But he could create it somewhere else. And where better than the land of his fathers, the land of Abraham, Judea. And it clicked into place for me as I'm reading this and researching that of course he would do that. He would try to find a suitable alternative for himself. And this was not only a good alternative, but what a revenge. What a revenge. Because he would go back there and he would leg it with all the slaves and all the people who were facilitating the Egyptian hierarchy in Egypt at that time. In fact, his chosen people, as they became known. He went back to the Israelites, who were people that he knew, whose ancestors were the same ancestors, half ancestors that he had. He went back for the slaves, he put them all together, And he went back and he fought the hierarchy for what he wanted. And this, bear in mind, is somebody who, if he walked into a room, people would fall flat on their knees, because this was a god. He was not only revered, he was feared. He was feared more than perhaps we can imagine, because he could do things that you and I would describe as paranormal. He was, in fact, connected to the esoteric knowledge by education that the high priests of Egypt and the reigning pharaohs and their families all knew about. And when I go on to tell you, perhaps in an hour or so, of what that knowledge consisted of, it will blow your minds, literally. You will not believe some of it. And I'm not going to be talking about legend then. I'm going to be talking about scientific, hard, proven facts. Facts that have only been available to us, to you and I, for the last 10 years, since I was started writing the book. Well, that science tells me that Moses was a very dangerous man, and he could do things that you and I would never believe, and I'm going to tell you some of them, and what they were and how he did them. But when he went back, he fought and he won. Translated to the line. We don't need to go into that. He won. And he legged it with his people. Well, where did he go to? Of course you know where he went to, don't you? Well, where else would he go to? He went to the place where he very carefully prepared for his return and for the journey to Judea with his people. That's where he headed straight for. And now, I'll go on to tell you what he did when he got there, or what Exodus says he did when he got there. Exodus has very little to say about his exile and what he did. We know he fathered 2 children, and of course pharaohs would have multiple wives, they all did. So that was no problem with the wife that he took with him, his second wife, whose name was Miriam, who went with him on the journey. And his half-brother or cousin, it's disputed as to which he was, Aaron, who also ruled Egypt for a brief period before he left to join Moses on Sinai. But Exodus, the most factual of the Gospels, has very little to say. I wonder why. I think I know why, but I can't prove why. I suspect it was because when Moses got there, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, what he actually did has many and varied accounts, and they're all higgledy-piggledy, they're all botched compared to what we now know he did, or what we think we know he did. And I'll tell you what happened. When he got back, he fought the Egyptians and he won. He picked up his people and he left. What did he do on arrival? He probably trotted off up the mountain, didn't he? He trotted off up there. There was lots of rumblings and fire and earth shakes, and he communed with God. Then he came back down. And he came back down with some stones. They weren't stones at all. That was another mistranslation. They were more likely crystals. And we now know archaeologically today that being the highest peak of that mountain range, Sinai has been bombarded with meteorites for centuries and millennia. And some meteorites contain crystalline substances which can be metallurgically transformed into other substances, such as, for example, iridium, which is a very widely used and highly precious metal today, but has to be processed from crystals, many of which appear in meteorites. But he came back down with these so-called rocks, which were probably crystals. We don't know that for sure. And he came back with the 10 Commandments. the Ten Commandments. What a load of rubbish. Because they weren't God's commandments at all. They were virtually a word-for-word copy of ancient texts that existed for generations, hundreds of years, before Moses was ever born. And in the library of the British Museum, there are copies containing these commandments, and they're virtually word for word. So they weren't new to Moses. They weren't new even to some of the leaders of the groups following him. But he needed them, and we can perhaps guess at some of the reasons why he needed them. He didn't need them for any other purpose except to keep these people in check. Like any good manager, as anybody who's managed people will know, people have to be motivated and they have to be kept under control somehow and motivated to do as you tell them. And Moses knew perfectly well that if he couldn't do that, then they were all dead, because what he was taking them out to face was something unthinkable. The vast waste of an area on this planet which is the harshest in the world. And they had to do exactly what he said, and so he gave them the Ten Commandments. There was no stone involved.
You know, he said the actual thou shalt actually occurs 12 times. You could say the 10 commands were actually 12.
You could. You could. I have no wish to sort of debate the accuracy of the Bible. Take it as you find it. Do the research for yourselves. But it is a mishmash, and it isn't what actually happened, and it has to be interpreted, and I've already mentioned to you the difficulties of that interpretation. But what we do know is he tipped off up the mountain, he came back with these crystals, as I would prefer to call them. And what did he do? He found that these people were down there, as soon as his back was turned, worshipping false gods. So in his temper he smashed them and had to go back down to get back up to get some more. You can imagine the frustration of Moses. He actually came down with the blueprints for the building of a box. It was an ordinary Egyptian carrying box of a specification that was well known. The only one that has ever been found in any, shall we say, questionable position ever in Egypt of a similar dimension was found inside the Great Pyramid. There was only one ever found. There was nothing in it, but it was found, and it was exactly the same dimensions as Moses' box, because it was a common dimension. It was a common carrying box. But this one had to be very special. So Moses also brought down with him rocks, crystals, substances, metallurgical substances, which he needed to put in that box, to transform it and to change it into what he needed it to do. And I'm going to go on to describe that for you and tell you what they were. But we only know now what they are, because it's only since 1996 in laboratories in America that we have processed the materials that I will go on to describe to you and known what they were. And they have some unbelievable properties. He brought down these substances. He brought with him the blueprints, the instructions, the dimensions, and he brought down with him a lot of gold. And he got helpers to bring more gold, because this gold was essential to this box. And I'll go on to describe why gold is essential to it. This is a fantastic thing, this ark. It's like as more and more of this research dawned on me, I began to think, hey, maybe this Exodus isn't as daft as it was after all, because, well, I'll go on to explain. I'd like to go back to the map as we go onwards. I'd like you to imagine now that they've built this box. They've built a place of worship to put it in, a tent. They built a Holy of Holies, as it was called. The Ark's in the tent. And off they go, legging it now for Judea. And the first thing you notice when you look at the map is, where the heck are they going? Because they're not going towards Judea at all. Judea was in fact far to the west, a direct route. Stick along the Med and go the way the Israelites from the sons of Abraham originally came into Egypt. Go that way. But don't go the way he's going. Why the heck was he going that way? And there are a couple of reasons why, of course. First of all, you'll notice that he never strays very far from the sea. When I say very far, okay, it may have been 20 miles, 40 miles, 100 miles. But it was near enough for people to travel backwards and forwards. It was near enough to access salt water. It was also near enough to go to where he really was heading for, which was the Promised Land, of course. It was Judea, of course. But not the direct route, because the direct route took him past fortifications and tribes which stood in his way and would have fought him. Fought for supremacy and stopped his progress. There were huge castles in between him and the Promised Land. But there were no castles in the direction Moses was going. He went up the side of the Gulf of Aqaba, again, close to seawater. And I'd like you to forget for a minute that he hopped off into the desert for another generation or so to wander around the Negev desert, for heaven's sake, the wilderness of Zin. Just forget that for a moment, please. By the time he got to Aqaba, he was looking at the Dead Sea, a big expanse of water, to the south of which there were no fortifications. Historically, there were no fortifications there. And his intention was to skirt around the Dead Sea and come up on any opposing forces from the opposite side, from, in fact, the south, where he was unexpected. And that's why he went that way. And that's what he did. So they ended their trek, in fact, at Mount Nebo, where we're told Moses died. Right on cue, his job finished. Well done, Moses. His chosen people were in sight of the Promised Land. He could look down across the River Jordan at that point and sigh and say, I did it. And he probably died on cue, overlooking the Promised Land. His people only had to cross it to get there. And if you believe all that and it's related, you will believe anything. We don't know how many people he took with him. Various numbers have been thrown at you through the Bible, in various books. And I tried to sort of think how those numbers would stack up. I've read 60,000. I've read 20,000. And of course, they would trot along with all the pigs, donkeys, horses, carts, sheep, everything that they could use as food, milk. And they would cross hundreds and hundreds of miles of the most harshest environment known to man. Let me tell you, that's utter nonsense. Because if you were to take a team of SAS men today and say to them, okay, get from Sinai to Judea without food or water, on foot, without logistics, intelligence, food, water, backup, helicopters, backpacks, weapons, they would never make it. They would never make it in a million years. This has to be the greatest journey ever undertaken by man, in my humble opinion. Greater even than the journey to the moon. It has to be. Because what I'm going to say to you is that Moses did it. He did it. And I hope I'm going to give you a plausible explanation in a few minutes as to how he did it. So how many of you would say to me that they think Moses actually did it? Did he actually take, say, 500 or 1,000 people, 2,000 people across those deserts with him without food or water? Did he actually do it? Anybody who thinks he did it, put their hands up, please.
Well, we could ask the question, were they deserts then, actually?
They were deserts then, yes.
How do you know?
Well, it's a historical fact. It's an historical, archaeological fact.
Well, there was trees growing in North Africa that don't live.
There may well be. May well be.
Eh?
There may well be. And your interpretation is just as valid as mine. But my opinion is that he did do it. And I will hopefully go on to tell you how he did it. But what I'm suggesting is that it was a totally impossible journey in practical terms, in real terms. And if you don't accept that he did it, do you believe then that all these stories, these dozens and dozens of well-documented stories were just legends? Do you believe that these translations that were prayed over, retranslated, discussed, taught, believed in, written about in many different manuscripts, written about in foreign manuscripts, foreign to the Middle East? Do you believe that, you must believe, if you don't believe he did it, that these were principally, mainly legends? Well, I don't, because I don't think it's credible to believe that. We'll take a tea break at that point if that's okay, and then I will come back and begin some of the explanations and some further interpretations and some further details. That's okay, let's take a break. Okay, so now I'm committed to telling you how we did it. I think I'll leave now. I'm no Brian Cox, obviously, and when I talk about science, I find it very heavy. So, but I'll do my best. I'll try to keep it as succinct as possible, and I'll try to explain a bit more about what was in this box and how it actually worked. I've got no chance with this audience because none of you believe that Moses actually did it, so I've not got a lot of chance of convincing you how he did it, have I? But yes, I will. I will, thank you. Right, I'll have a go. I won't leave. Martin, come back with the car, please. Thank you. I have a feeling that not a lot of you will know some of the very latest science that is hard fact now. And I think I'm probably in the company of a number of other people here who would say the reason why that perhaps you don't know is because it isn't publicised, it isn't talked about, it's commercial, no, it's increasingly commercial, and the knowledge that I'm going to impart to you is not generally known for that fact, because it is absolutely staggering. We have, in the past decade, made incredible strides in particle physics and quantum theory. Some of you may already know that you can take a particle of matter, measure it, record it, see where it is, touch it, feel it, and then for no apparent reason it will suddenly appear in a totally different position, not having appeared to have moved at all. In fact, particles of matter do that a lot, and we don't know why they do it, but we're beginning to understand. We're also beginning to understand that they are actually changed physically by our own observation of them. I mean, what's going on here? We're said to be made up of strings, little waves that vibrate, and ourselves vibrate, and everything around us vibrates. And when they vibrate at a certain frequency, and we're vibrating at that frequency, we can see them, touch them, feel them, perceive them as what they are: a desk, a table. But if any one of those things starts to vibrate at a different frequency, then we don't perceive it as a table at all. We will perceive it as something entirely different. Hard scientific fact. We are nothing but strings or waves, particles of matter that vibrate. It's called string theory. Look it up, research it yourself. It's a scientific fact. But to come to the Moses type science, even if Moses didn't understand this science or didn't understand what was going on, he knew about it and he used it because he had been taught it by the high priest of Ra in Heliopolis in Egypt when he was a young man. And he tried it out and he tested it and he experimented with it over 25 years during the process of his exile. When I tell you the first little bit, it is that we have in the past 10 years discovered entirely new elements which were never known to us, never known to exist until the final years of the 20th century. Those elements are known as monatomic elements. They're not the same form of matter as the matter that they start off with, because they can be created in a laboratory by transmuting certain types of metal, in particular precious metals, into this other substance. I won't attempt to describe how they do it, but if I said to you, they superheat it, and then supercool it, superheat it and supercool it. They add other elements to it. And what happens? So what, you say? What happens to it? I'll tell you what happens. And you remember something about what I said earlier. Gold, for example, when it's treated by this process, turns into a white powder. It turns into white powder, and in the process of turning into a white powder, it apparently loses half of its weight. Where's it gone? Well, I'll tell you where it's gone. It hasn't gone at all. What's happened is that this white powder that the gold has turned into is no longer a metallic substance. It diminishes the effects of gravity on itself. Proven, hard, scientific fact in laboratories today. And, even more staggeringly, it transfers that property into the vessel or the scales or whatever it is standing on, will also appear then to be lighter. In some cases, these substances have been proven to levitate. And I mean float.
turn of the century, science, not magic, not fable, not hearsay. Let me tell you a bit more about this white powder. It's unbelievable. This white powder, as we know, was something that Moses carried around with him. It was something that he brought down from the mountain. And I'll tell you where he got it from. Because in 1906, a man called Sir William Flinders Petrie excavated what had never been uncovered before on top of Sinai. And he found hundreds of kilos of this white powder buried beneath flagstones. It was what Moses had processed, knew how to process, brought down from the mountain with him and put in the ark. And it was always referred to in the Bible as being bread. It wasn't bread at all. And I'll tell you what it does, in addition to what I've already told you. This white powder has been shown, demonstrated, to make changes to the double helix structure of your and my DNA. In other words, if you were to eat a quantity of this white powder and it went into your bloodstream, it affects your DNA and it changes it and it alters it. And in fact, what it does is it corrects it and it makes it more perfect. Now this is a white powder, remember, that Moses has in his box. What did he have it in his box for? Well, I've already told you one reason he had it in his box. It lied in his box. It made it portable. Hard scientific fact. Not hearsay, proven fact. Let me give you a quotation. I won't give you the several highly respected sources who put their names to this, but I'll read it out for you because it's worth listening to. Don't all go running for your phones at the same time. Orbitally rearranged monatomic platinum group metals will, under the right conditions, resonate, vibrate, with deformed human cells, body cells, causing the DNA of the body to become corrected. Instead of destroying tissues with radiation or killing the immune system with chemotherapy, such a prospective remedy already today will rectify those cells when taken regularly, whether they are cancerous or not. Latest research. Not many people know that. And it gets better. It gets better. Monatomic elements, such as those transmuted from gold, have further unbelievable properties. They have been found to be superconductive. Now, before you grow, superconductivity is not something that is generally known outside of scientific circles. But I'll read you something else in a moment, which will tell you a bit more about what it is. I'll repeat it for you, and I'll quote. A superconductor. You literally start a superconductor flowing by applying a magnetic field to it. Any sort of a magnetic field. It responds to this immediately by building a null magnetic field around itself. It's called a Meissner field. And it flows light inside this field. And light, as you know, is an incredible thing. It can't be measured very easily, but it can be contained. It doesn't belong in one particular place or any particular realm of space, but we can contain it. We can add limitless light to the same space and therefore build up the light within that space. In the case of a superconductor, it would make it brighter and brighter. And it would be possible to transfer those rays of light outwards and create what we would call today a laser. And as we all know, lasers can be very, very destructive. But it gets better. If I take a magnet and some of this substance contained in the box, and I put the magnet down here, and I walk away from it, and I don't come back for 100 years, it will still be emitting light. There is no, as they call, scientific resistance. There's no rundown of the light. It doesn't fade, it doesn't die, it doesn't go away. It continues to emit that light in what is essentially a vacuum forever. It creates light from nothing. Scientific fact. Scientific fact. It creates particles of matter from nothing. The US Naval Research Institute in the latter part of the 20th century did some tests on human cells, and they discovered that human cells don't only vibrate at certain frequencies, but their scientific papers suggested that the human cells themselves may actually be superconductive. And they concluded that a person with enough of this substance inside him could, under certain conditions, be more intelligent than you and I, because his DNA would be far more correct than you and I. He could run further, run faster, live longer. It has even been suggested that it can be used as a form of mental communication between one superconductive cell in my brain and one superconductive cell in yours. Scientific fact. So, I mean, I'm not kidding you. Seriously, I leave to your imagination the effects that a quantity of such a substance, manna, monatomic gold, would have on the box that Moses created. Abracadabra. We have a box now that can, under certain circumstances, as well as being portable, be turned into a weapon. A weapon which emitted concentrated rays of light and more than capable, for example, of destroying the walls of a city. Because the size of this capacitor, as it would be called in modern terms, is huge by comparison with some of the devices they use to emit lasers from. This is big in relative terms. Please excuse me for reading again. This time, for the first time, during the process of my research, I was absolutely riveted. Excavations at Jericho revealed that there were two parallel constructions of about 27 feet high, with the main inner wall being 12 feet thick. The extensive damage to the massive mud brick fortifications may well have suggested an earthquake, but there is no geological evidence of an earthquake at that historical point in time in that geographic area, and there would also have been other accompanying evidence, and there was none. So the legend that Moses fought the Battle of Jericho with his weapon might not be quite as daft as it sounds. The date was precisely established as being between 1400 and 1250 BC, which tallies exactly with the dates we have commencing with the birth of Moses around 1330 BC and moving forward through the subsequent periods of his lifetime as recounted by the scriptures. The dates tally exactly. And the damage tallies exactly. And we know now what he was carrying. The accounts, therefore, that at first sight appeared ridiculous, accounts of the ark's reputation as a destructive and terrible weapon, of its apparently levitating, of its emitting light rays, of its afflicting those who looked upon it with leprosy and other ailments, because it would have been radioactive, tallies exactly now. If they handled it unprotected, they were burned. Moses was burned, or he had a glowing face when he came down from the mountain. We're now beginning to get into the realms of possibility for this box being of immense value to Moses, both as a food to feed his people with and as a weapon. We have him carrying around a casket made from acacia wood, which was lined inside and out with the purest gold. It just happens that gold in that form is a very adequate insulator before such as its contents would be activated. It insulated it from the outside world and from damaging the outside world. But when they were triggered, when whatever electricity or magnet was applied, whatever trigger it was, we don't know what the trigger was, it was portable, it was deadly, and it carried a superfood with it. So, our Moses, if he was clever, and I think he was, he moved his people in stages, however many they were, with their pigs and their cattle and their horses and their donkeys and their sheep and their goats, and he fed them as he went, and he fed them all with this substance. We could speculate. And he moved along not very far from the sea, and he distilled seawater perhaps. He would have known where the oases were. He would have had many contacts. He would have had many helpers going backwards and forwards. And we begin to perceive how he might have done it. I could perceive. He had many followers who believed as he did that he had been denied his birthright and should have continued as Pharaoh. He was privy to the secrets of the ancients and one of the few most highly educated personages in that region. He had communed with the gods, and the widespread belief would thus be that he would one day join them and become one of them. These people were in awe of him. In his time and culture, he was under the protection of the gods. He was greater than any high priest. He was a powerful magician. And the answer to the problem of his return, therefore, is that Moses just walked right in there and took his people. He chose them, he cherry-picked them. They were his chosen people. He took whatever slaves he wanted. He took the Israelites, who were his people anyway. They had the same ancestors, as of course did the Hebrews anyway. And he led it. He fought them and he won. We don't have to go into any further detail. And he headed straight for Sinai, where he'd been marooned in exile for 25 years, manufacturing and sourcing and planning the building of the ark, which would take him across these unbelievably hostile deserts with however many people there were. He used and ingested monatomic gold. He would have done that ever since he was a boy. And other of the noble metals such as platinum. And in the guise of manna, the ark would have contained vast quantities of it. Quantities which could be replenished by the gold they carried with them. And it levitated. It took 4 men to carry this box. if you take the specifications, which are the most detailed in the whole of the Bible, in the scriptures there is nothing more detailed than the specification of how he built that ark. Its size, its dimensions, what it was made of. And if you take that specification, it weighed more than 2 tons. 4 men couldn't lift it off the ground. So why the heck did he carry it through the desert? It contained a superconductor. It contained superconductive elements, and they lightened the box to such an extent that it became portable. I'd like you to imagine, as I did, the sight of this box. It was lined inside and out with pure gold. It had 2 angels on the top with outspread wings. And when it was activated, there was an arc of electricity passed between these 2 wings. And these people would be carrying it. And it would be emitting lasers so deadly that it destroyed everything in its path. Imagine what some of these guys, these Philistines, must have thought when they saw him approaching with this. It was awesome. And I bet he didn't stay around very long. He fought many battles, including Samson and Delilah, being involved in one of those battles after he arrived, using the ark. And he always saw what happened to it. What happened to this unbelievable artifact? Well, the stories are legion. And most of it we can glean from some of the records until we get to relatively modern times, which is the Middle Ages. But initially, we start off with the carbon dating at Jericho, which tallies with the timescales recounted in ancient manuscripts and starts us off. That battle, by archaeology, modern archaeology, at around 1350 BC. The ancient artifact built under the guidance of Moses, however, its modern scientific description was it was a very large capacitor. Bearing in mind its known size and content, the stories about it would have been legion. It would have had this huge reputation, and strangely, it sort of fell out of the stories because it was in a way superfluous. Because when it appeared, they always won. So eventually, they didn't even have to bother carrying it. They just arrived, and people ran away. So it starts to get a bit not mentioned. There's a lot of accounts of subsequent battles they fought, not least with the Philistines, who first occupied the shores of where they were headed prior to Moses. They came from Turkey. And some of them are still, their descendants are still in Palestine today. So they're not all Arabs by descent in Palestine and the Lebanon and Syria. There are many of what we would have termed, or they would have termed, Philistines in those days. The Hebrew Bible tells us that the first permanent temple to house the ark was erected on the top of Mount Zion in the city of Jerusalem. And having been portable until then, i.e. carried around in a tent, as we've said, they had to build a temple for it. There are 2 or 3 places on top of Mount Zion, because it's quite an extensive hill, for want of a better term, where that first temple could have been. We don't know where that was, but we do know that when King David had unified the whole of Judea, King David was one of the subsequent Israelis. For that first construction, that was dated, and probably fairly exactly dated, to the 10th century, or
around 1050 BC, and the leading light among the Israelites then was the fabled King Solomon. And he was said to live to a ripe old age and be very wise and have certain powers. And I've no doubt he was taking the monatomic gold himself as well, as you would. Descendant of Moses, descendant of David and Abraham. But sadly, because of the pillaging and the looting and the greed and the cruelty and the religious rivalry and the continued and unceasing attempts to come and get this ark, everybody knew about this ark. The whole world knew about this ark. They had to know. They didn't need a telegraph for this to be handed around. And they wanted it. It's just like, you know, I'm Manchester United and I've won the league for the last 3 seasons. I'm going to beat you. And some of them probably will this season. But what I'm trying to say is, it was a target. And obviously, the indigenous Jews, those descendants of the original Israelites, were not fools. It has been speculated at various times that they removed it completely, hid it somewhere, hid it on Mount Zion, that they removed parts of it, leaving the accoutrements and the gold and the jewels and the valuables, but not the essentials, for the Philistines to come in and ransack and pillage and loot and go away. It's been postulated that a dozen different things could have happened to it, but no, we have to talk now about a body of people that came along and wanted to find it for themselves centuries later, after the time of Jesus, and they were the Templars. Because the Templars occupied Jerusalem. It was their headquarters for the whole of the 12th century, for over 100 years. And they came with the second, I think it was the second Crusaders, second lot of Crusaders, who fought the Muslims again. They'd lost the first time. And the second time around, they beat the Muslims. And the Templars were originally 8 knights that came with the Crusaders to protect the pilgrims that would follow on when Jerusalem was free. And they're headquartered on the top of Mount Zion. And of course, the first thing they did was look for this ark. So they dug around for it, they excavated, and they found absolutely zilch. It had gone. And we know that that was around the turn of the 12th century, 13th century. So they made inquiries, as you say. They tortured people, they questioned people. And we know that the Templars then went along to the Middle East, to Egypt, to try to find it, because that is historically recorded. The Templars did voyage there. And the Templars didn't find it in Egypt either, because these Essenes, this band of people who were with the ark from the very beginning, they were Israelites, but they were a special brand of Israelite. They were a religious sect with certain beliefs, and they became the guardians of the ark, along with the elders of the Israelites. And they were very clever. And if they'd removed it, where would they remove it to? We know that Solomon had a mistress. And that mistress, historically we know this, not legend. He had a mistress, and that mistress was the Queen of Sheba. She was the Queen of Egypt. And they had a son, and the son was therefore the next ruler of the Israelites. And his name was Menelik. And Menelik must have decided, this is my thinking now, having done this research,
He was fed up with all these people coming in and trying to steal his ark and get rid of all the valuables and take him away and make him poor again and rape his women and kill his soldiers. He got fed up with it. So he decided, as the son of Solomon and the son of the Queen of Egypt, to move it to where it had come from. He decided to move it. And he did, a temple was actually physically built, you can go and see it today, on an island in the middle of the Nile, dedicated to and intended to house the ark. But when the Templars got there was no ark there. Because these Essenes were more than clever, they built a replica of the ark, which purported to be the ark, appeared to be the ark, looked like the ark, was covered in gold, but there was no superconductor in it. It was a ploy, it was a decoy. And that same Ark of the Covenant is today reputed to reside in Axum, which is a very famous place in northern Africa, in Ethiopia. And nobody has been able to get in because the priests won't let them in to see it. But they say that this is where the ark now rests. Rubbish. It doesn't rest there at all. Because the Templars tracked it down and found it didn't. So they eventually discovered where the ark had been taken to. And when I tell you, you'll say, good heavens, that's amazing. Dozens of famous and infamous attempts have been put forward over the years to say where that ark was moved to. And they have variously placed the remains of the ark in North America, France, Egypt, and most famously of all, of course, in Scotland. But I decided that the most likely possibility of where they found it was precisely where Moses died, on Mount Nebo. Inside the workings, inside the temple, where Moses died and looked down on the River Jordan and knew that his people could now move into the Promised Land. That's where they took their ark, and that's where I believe, and I figured out, I speculated that the Templars took it because, and they almost must have found it, because these Templars became the most successful and powerful body of men ever. More powerful than the Romans. But whereas the Romans conquered by force, the Templars conquered by finance. They controlled the finances of every country between here and the Far East, the whole of Europe, most of North Africa. And by the end of the 12th century and into the 13th century, people had become jealous. Very powerful people had become jealous. Pope Clement had become jealous. And assisted by the King of France and his armies, rumours reached the Templars that they were for it. They were going to be taken, and they were going to be captured, and they were going to be imprisoned. And whatever it was they had was going to be taken away. And so, historically, this is not the Bible, historically it is known that in November of 1307, before these arrests could be made, the whole of the Templar fleet, some 50 to 100 ships, sailed out of La Rochelle in France and disappeared. They were never seen again. And we can only assume that they took the ark with them. And there are lots of theories as to where they could have taken it. As I said to you, some say North Africa, some say North America. There are sites over there that historically are dedicated to the Ark. But it makes a lot of sense to suggest that they legged it to the nearest place to the west coast of France, which was the south coast of Ireland, which was a place where they would have been welcomed, because Ireland at that time welcomed a lot of Norman French, Spanish, French, and continental peoples. And they travelled up the west coast of Ireland, and from there moved across to Scotland. And it's Scotland where today, if you read about the Templars, you will read that the Templars established the church and the Ark rests in that church. Now, I'm writing a book, and I now have a book. I've got the bottom of the iceberg now. I think I know, where it was possible, plausible, for the Templars to have taken this Ark. And I could now build that into my Legacy of the Sphinx. And I was a happy man. And it's very interesting. I'll tell you a story associated with that. And that is that at the Battle of Bannockburn, which was fought, as you know, between Robert the Bruce and the English, the Scots won for the very first time. Why did they win? Well, historically, we know, and it is said, and it is written, and it's recorded, and it's historical knowledge that we already know. They were accompanied by a body of Templars. But what is not in the history books, and what isn't always stated, and what is not said, is that legend had it, the stories were, that this body of Templars came not only to assist Robert the Bruce militarily, but they carried with them, in the front of them, an unknown weapon in a box. Fascinating, isn't it? I've no idea whether they did or didn't. But I had my book. And what I'm going to do now is conclude. But before I do so, I would like to suggest a couple of things to you and then read you a final quotation about the science you've heard tonight. And I would like to say this personally. We know that the true nature of reality is not as we look at it and perceive it. We know that. It doesn't take a fool to know that. And we know that these people in the Bible, such as Jesus and Moses, did exist. There's far too much anecdotal and written evidence. But we don't know what they said. I mean, the Romans didn't treat Jesus with any special consideration at all. The Romans crucified hundreds of men, women and children every single day. Jesus was just a fly on the window. He was troubled because he was a preacher. But we know he existed. But we can't be sure of what they said and did. We don't know what they said and did, and anybody who tells you that they know or suggests that they know not just what they said but how they thought and why they did what they did, I have no time for that. But I personally believe, as a result of my research, that the Exodus was real, that it happened. That it happened perhaps not exactly in the way that it was told, but very similar things happened and assisted Moses, and Moses was able to do what the Bible says he did. I believe that, having done the research. I believe the Ark of the Covenant was real, and that it was the most extraordinary object in the whole of our history. And now I'm going to leave you with a momentous quotation, at least I thought it was momentous, from a respected, very respected scientific commentator, and it wasn't Brian Cox. The beginning of the 21st century is the tragic end of a wonderful scientific pioneering era. But the new science is now for the big league players. It is being pursued by those with far less socially motivated interests at government and corporate level. The precious mineral markets have already moved into a new platform of strategic operation, which will shortly begin to affect every single one of our lives. And you may have read how China are trying to corner the markets in gold, get hold of the African mines, get hold of every bit of phosphorus they can get a hand on. You may have read about that. So what this guy is saying, very respectable guy, and you can have the sources if you would like to email me. The future masters of the globe will therefore be those who control these markets. The materials of the future in a world of superconductor technology, an anti-gravity realm of levitation, teleportation and parallel dimensions, and space-time manipulation. We shall not travel to the stars. If we survive as a race, we shall be transported to them. Thank you very much for listening.